Welcome to the Deep Dive Spirituality Conversations podcast. I'm your host, Brian Russell, and today it's a privilege and an honor to have Dr. Peter Rollins as my guest. Peter is an author, philosopher, storyteller, producer of short films, and a public speaker. He has a PhD in post-structural thought from Queen's University in Belfast. He was born in Belfast and he currently resides in Los Angeles. You can hear him on his own podcast where he's the co-host of the Fundamentalist podcast. He also has lots of videos on YouTube and has produced books such as Insurrection, the Idolatry of God, and one of my personal favorites, The Divine Magician. We have a wide-ranging conversation today, but focus on what I think are critical issues in the life of faith, particularly in 2021, which are the issues of certainty versus uncertainty, faith and doubt, and the role that contradiction plays in our thinking and even in our living and in our spiritual growth. You're going to really enjoy this conversation. Thank you for listening. Let's jump right into the interview. Well, welcome to the show, Pete. Thanks so much for your time today.
It's great to be on the show and be part of this. Thank you.
Looking back, what have been some key moments in your intellectual, spiritual journey that led you to embrace a call to philosophy, having a community icon, and now sort of being an independent scholar and teacher through Patreon?
Yeah, it's always difficult to know your own influences. Sometimes actually it's easier when someone else looks at you and they make connections. There was a book came out a few years ago, and in it, somebody made a connection between my work and growing up in Northern Ireland, for example, and I'd never made that connection. So what they argued to some extent was I grew up during a conflict, and it was a very divisive conflict. There were more peace walls in Northern Ireland than anywhere else in Europe, dividing communities, Protestant from Catholic, and it was a 30-year war. And a lot of my work, in a sense, is a beautiful metaphor for the walls we create within ourselves and between ourselves and others in more kind of metaphorical ways. A lot of my work is about notice, or at least it began with going, how do we break those walls down? That often we project parts of ourselves into other people. Mm-hmm. We see that parts of ourselves that we don't like and we put them on someone else and we think it's them who's angry, frustrated, who's intolerant, or who's greedy. And these elements of myself I put onto the other. And a lot of my work started with creating a space in Belfast where we could come together and we could try to face those parts of ourselves and not project them onto others. So I don't know if it's true or not, but I think something about growing up in that society has influenced and impacted the way I do things before I ever came to philosophy, before I ever came to the intellectual life, which was quite late on, actually. I wasn't in the academic world at all until I was about 18 or 19 was when I first basically read a book for pleasure. I only started to get into philosophy as I was approaching 20. Before that, I had years of just seeing how conflict arises, how divisions arise, how people create camps, and how we somehow, in order to break those divides down, have to do some deep inner work.
Mm-hmm. And you're one of the first theologian philosophers that I know I've encountered in my life that has done a lot of reading in psychotherapy, for example. I know I've heard you speak about Jacques Lacan before, and even Zizek. Again, he's a philosopher, but he's read a lot of Lacan. So where does that influence come into? And is that exactly because you're looking for persons who can talk about differences, contradictions? Was it natural to go to those type of thinkers, or how did you get introduced to psychoanalysis and then think that connects with theology in some way?
Yeah. Okay. That's a very good question. So, here's the thing. The reason A lot of people think we're utilitarians, right? That human beings act towards their own self-interest, right? So almost like what's called evolutionary psychology. You take the principles of evolution, you apply them to subjectivity, you apply them to the mind, and you can basically broadly understand human behavior. This is very much questioned within psychoanalysis. So in psychoanalysis, it's a critique of psychology, and it's a critique of evolutionary psychology in particular, because the idea is that we don't act in our own self-interest. We often act in destructive ways. We often undermine ourselves. We often repeat behaviors that are not good for us at all. We do this all the time, whether it's breaking up with somebody whenever it's a good relationship, or messing up a job that we're actually enjoying, or overeating or oversleeping or gambling. We do all of these behaviors that from a purely evolutionary perspective, you go, why would you do this? And psychoanalysis kind of is its bread and butter is working with people who seem to be getting in their own way, their own worst enemy, doing destructive things. Now, psychoanalysis, Lacan is the analyst who philosophers study. So a lot of philosophers study Lacan because he's the philosophical psychoanalyst. He was a brilliant psychoanalyst, but in terms of theory, understanding the unconscious, understanding subjectivity, but he also has some very deep understanding of the nature of reality. So I was interested because religion has always also been interested in this question. Some people think of religion as a way of managing communities, bringing people together, a way of superstitious belief, et cetera, et cetera. But I would say that actually religion at its purest has always been about how to manage what Freud calls the death drive, this death instinct. In theology, it's called sin. But basically this instinct, this movement against ourselves, against our world, and against each other, trying to understand that and come to terms with it, and also break the back of it. So psychoanalysis and religion have this similar kind of interest. And then existentialism as a philosophy, and what German idealism as a philosophy has also had that question. So the short, in a nutshell, answer is that psychoanalysis, I think, is an incredibly important discipline if we genuinely want to try to understand why it is that we're bad utilitarians. Like dogs and cats are amazing utilitarians. They've all read Bentham and Mill. They maximize their pleasure, they minimize their pain. But human beings are these kind of derailed creatures where we can try to make, for example, not enough money to be happy, but it's more and more money until we get a heart attack, until we betray our friends, until we destroy our families. If we were selfish, you'd stop at a certain amount of money. But what is that drive to have more and more? That's ultimately the zombie death drive. And I suppose that's why psychoanalysis, I think, is important.
And I mean, you just made a natural connection to theology. Can you connect that? Like, what might the church learn from some of these thinkers? Again, Lacan's super hard to read, and so is Zizek, but in a sense, you always have been able to translate these things. So what is it that you would hope like persons that are trying to live, say, a Christian life would get from the very types of things that you said? What's the contribution that maybe these type of thinkers have to theology, and specifically like to a person's life in the church?
Yeah. Okay, so I would say that New Age philosophies and a lot of secular philosophy, humanism, also a lot of religious confessional Christianity has this notion of a type of non-antagonistic reality, that actually what we want and what we strive for is a type of getting rid of contradiction, getting rid of this experience of of conflict. We imagine utopias. And what I would argue is that actually this is actually the problem. So I'll start with psychoanalysis and I'll connect it with theology. Is that in psychoanalysis, the idea is I come to the analyst because maybe I have some symptoms. For some reason, I cannot sleep. I've got a bad back. I'm chewing my mouth. I'm gripping my teeth. I've got all of these symptoms and it's just damaging my health. I find that I'm throwing up. Let's take that example. I'm eating, but I throw up 3 times a week. I keep throwing up. Now, through analysis, what you might discover is that that is a symptom in which there is something undigestible in your past experience. Something has happened that you cannot digest, which is the name of a trauma that you cannot put into words. And as you put it into words, you no longer are being sick, because the sickness is a type of bodily expression of something that you cannot stomach. You can't stomach something, you can't digest something. Now, the idea is in psychoanalysis, you start to work through the symptoms, but every time you work through a symptom, you don't come to a good conclusion, you come to a deeper symptom. So a symptom is the congealment of a contradiction. You both want to speak, you want to stay silent, you love someone and you hate someone, you're desirous of something, you're fearful of something. And the symptom is a type of like incarnation of that contradiction within your life. And so you look at the first contradiction and you say, you know, I can't, I'm always being sick. And then that leads you to going like, well, there's something you can't digest about your relationship with your partner. There's something you cannot speak. That you, in fact, there's something that you want to get out of your body, perhaps. You want to get your partner out of you. You feel they're too close. You look at that, and then you go, oh, this connects with your work, and this connects with some relationship you have with people at work. And then you get to that, and then you go, this connects actually with your earliest relationships with your family. And what happens at every step of the way is the contradiction isn't fixed. It's brought deeper and deeper and deeper. And finally, you get to the point at which you realize that life is a contradiction, that we're full of ambivalent feelings. And the cure is not when you get rid of all of the contradictions and find some sort of utopic wholeness. It's when you actually are able to take responsibility for the contradictions that you are, that you're able to actually enjoy that dimension of yourself. You're able to have a certain level of ambivalence within the world. Now, the reason why this is important is even the very nature of our economy, we're always driven to thinking that if we had this thing, the right partner, enough money, the right place, whatever it is, if we had X, we would be happy. And it's like the carrot that you never get. So you go into the place where the car is that you've been saving up money for, you've really wanted this car, and you drive it off the lot. And literally it depreciates in value as soon as it's driven off the lot, but also libidinally, its value diminishes as you drive it off the lot. And maybe not immediately, but very quickly you're going, okay, what's the next car? What's the new technology? How fast does the new improved model go? We're always looking for the next thing. And we're tyrannized by this search for wholeness, completeness, and satisfaction. And a lot of my work is about saying that it's not about being satisfied. We need freedom from the desire to be satisfied, right? Mm-hmm. We need a space in our lives where we're free to be unhappy, to embrace dissatisfaction, to embrace incompleteness. And if I can just keep going for a second, I know I'm waffling, but I'll finish this.
This is really helpful, so thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, I'll take the example of, you know, how Freud initially thought of this. So I'm going to simplify the Oedipal complex. And the Oedipal complex is this guy, Oedipus, wants to sleep with his mother. His father is preventing this. He doesn't know it's his mother, but, you know, he desires his mother. He gets rid of the father, kills the father to sleep with the mother. And he thinks this is going to be great. Like the mother is this desirous object that he wants, this incestuous object he wants. And when he gets it, it's a curse. It's cursed. That's Freud's way of saying, be careful what you wish for, right? Fulfill your dreams so that you realize that your dreams do not fulfill you, so that you realize the abject horror of your dreams, right? Because the mother is a type of symbol of wholeness and completeness, of oceanic oneness. The mother is like a symbol of returning to the ground of being, getting the thing that will just work and fix your life. The father is a prohibition that, you know, prevents you from getting the thing that you want. Oedipus breaks through the prohibition, is with the mother, and it's a disaster. Just like if you have a kid, there's two ways you can make a toy sacred and magical. The first is to take it away from them. If you remove a toy, they start to go, I really want that toy, right? So the removal of the toy, the prohibition generates an excessive pleasure, what's called a jouissance for the toy. The other is, so one is the threat of taking it away, and the other is, somebody else playing with it, someone else has it, you want it. These various ways of, oh, I want this. It generates this excessive desire. And of course, as soon as the kid gets it again, it becomes not a sacred object, but a regular object. Now, the reason why the Oedipal story is so interesting, and this, I don't think this has been very, very much researched or looked into, but the Bible starts with an Oedipal story, right? It's Adam and Eve are in the garden. There's a fruit tree and there's a prohibition. If you eat from the fruit of the tree, you're not allowed to, but the serpent says you will become like gods. You will, to become like God traditionally is to lack, to become whole and complete. Now, here's the irony. The irony is it's the prohibition not to eat the fruit that makes the fruit so desirable, right? So you still really, really want it. Now, for Freud, the superego is the internal, external voice, right? It feels like it's external, but it's within you. This voice that tells you you should be nicer to your mum, or you should have more friends, or you should have more money. It's the you should, in order to be whole and complete, in order to get rid of guilt. Because guilt is simply the name for not being who I think I should be. It's a type of existential lack where I feel that I'm not living up to who I am. So you want to, the superego is attempting to help you overcome your guilt. Now, by the way, it's hedonistic guilt today. So it's guilt that you're not having enough sex, going to enough parties, having enough fun, right? But it's still guilt. It's still you should, live your life to like self-help is amazing at generating guilt. You should just do it. I mean, what a demand, just do it. I think it's Nike says that, like the demand to be productive, to the demand to life hack, the demand to be the best, to how horrible is that we're having to have this guilt that always we're not quite, who we should be, right? So that's the superego. In the Bible, it's called the serpent. The serpent is the voice that is saying, you need that fruit. You'll be like God. You'll lack the lack. Just take that piece of fruit and everything will be great, right? Now, for Freud, you have to not obey the superego. In a sense, you have to break its back. You have to get rid of it. Mm-hmm. And I would say in Christianity, the point is not to obey the serpent. The point is to exorcise it. The serpent's voice is not the voice that you obey. It's the voice that you need to get rid of. However, today we are serpentine. We're always trying to obey that voice, to be better, to have more, to do more. The technology of exorcism in Christianity is called grace. Mm-hmm. Grace is the technology in which you discover that you don't have to do anything, not that you're fine, not that you're perfect the way you are at all, anything. It's almost like I'm not okay, you're not okay, and that's okay. It's the moment of not striving. And of course, this gets to one of the first contradictions that Paul really wrestles with, which is, well, if you don't have to do anything to change, will you not just be an asshole? Will you not just go and do terrible things? And of course, Paul says, no, the irony is, just like in AA, grace, the moment that you're accepted and in that circle, you say you're an alcoholic, you admit the truth because the truth will set you free, right? You admit the truth in a community that doesn't ask you to change, that just says, we're there too, you're accepted. Ironically, that is the very thing that then enables change to happen. So that's my reading of how this looks for Christianity. Is ironically, Christianity for me can be a radical technology, a space in which we are freed from the pursuit of perfection. We are freed from the pursuit of satisfaction. We are freed from the tyranny of happiness. We enter into the darkness. But the irony is, as we embrace unhappiness and dissatisfaction, doubt, complexity, and ambiguity, we actually find ourselves happier, more joyful, and living a more fulfilling life.
Yeah, that was really powerful. And I'm going to try to weave together a question out of all that, because this gets right to the heart of what I really want to talk about. This is why I always appreciate your work. You help me think about these really difficult existential issues that really most people of faith come to. I remember when you signed a book for my wife and I, when we met you in Florida back in 2016, you put in there, God rid you of God, which
Yes.
which is that, which I didn't realize at the time, but that's that quote from Meister Eckhart. So that's an interesting prayer. And then I want to go back and connect that. Maybe you've been talking about doubt and uncertainty. And that's what I found really helpful about your work, because you don't hear too many pastors and theologians talking about, hey, let's embrace more doubt and more uncertainty. Though at some level, as I've gotten older, the quality of my life actually depends on how much uncertainty I can actually hold on to without completely dropping off a cliff somewhere. And then this is going to be a long question. Then, you talked about grace, and, one of the thinkers that I never would have read if I hadn't engaged you is Paul Tillich. I mean, he's a famous theologian, but at least from my side of Wesleyan Arminian evangelicalism, that wasn't a thinker that we really engaged most of the time. But, you introduced courage to be in one of the conversations, and you use a phrase from Tillich, which I love, and I've seen this in his work. He talks about grace being accepting the fact that you're unconditionally accepted, which is awesome. I love that. I share that with almost everybody now. So that's there's a big weave of a question there. So you have the power of grace, which is accepting the fact that you're unconditionally accepted, the reality that there's huge amounts of doubt and uncertainty that are all kind of floating around. And then that can even, when you take it Meister Eckhart, like a mystic, God rid you of God. So at some level, there's uncertainty about who God is. I don't know if there's a question what I just said, but can you weave all that stuff together and just respond to, I guess I'm going to say that neglected part of spirituality, which is the immensity of uncertainty, with the reality that you can have this experience of being unconditionally accepted, even in the conditions of extreme uncertainty.
Yes, and actually, there's a way of connecting those two things, which we might get to in this interview or another one. But there's a lot of richness in that. And let me try to kind of access what you're saying in relation to Atheism for Lent, which is currently running, might be over by the time this goes out. But, just for your listeners, once a year, I run this kind of, I call it decentering practice, where for 40 days, people get reflections every day of Lent that basically introduce critiques of theology and critiques of theism. But one of the reasons why I do it is because actually people think atheism and theism are opposites. They think they're at war, and they think oh my goodness, by the way, that's a type of symptom, because often there's a bit of an atheist in theists and a bit of a theist in atheists, right? It's much more complicated, but we try to simplify it, and we project the disavowed, the repressed element onto somebody else. Instead of me, encountering my own questioning, I want to put it out onto somebody else. But the reason why I bring up Atheism for Lent is during Atheism for Lent, every week is a different epoch and a different way, a different type of critique of theism. The first week, because I assume people are coming in with, let's call it a proto-religious notion of God. And what I mean by proto-religious is God is a big being. God is a bigger, better version of myself, right? So there's that common notion of God. The first week of Atheism for Lent is a negation of that. And we look at a lot of critiques that are the logical critiques of that type of theism, trying to show that that kind of God is a incoherent notion, or that we cannot know if God exists, etc. But then after that week, the next week is the Apophatic tradition. And the Apophatic tradition is also an atheist tradition, because the Apophatic tradition says every time you say God, you say less than God. God is greater than God, right? We have to name God, nominate God, and then we have to denominate God, to dename. And it's funny, churches are called denominations, right? We denominate. In other words, I can say God is love, but then I go, but not the way I understand love, right? So, once you understand the Apophatic tradition, you actually realize that Anselm, who said it most powerfully in his Proslogion, says, God, if God exists, God must be beyond being, right? Because there's three levels of being: something that exists in the mind, but not in reality, like a painting. I can have a thought of a painting, but it doesn't exist in reality. Then there's stuff that can exist in reality and exist in the mind. So I can then paint that painting, and it exists in reality, and I have a concept of it in my mind. And then Anselm says, but there's always the possibility of something that exists in reality that cannot be contained by the mind. And then Anselm then says, if God exists, God would be that which exists in reality, but cannot be contained by the mind. And then Anselm tries to make a very clever kind of what's called the ontological argument from that, but that's for another time. But that's a form of atheistic critique. Then the week after, we look at the critique of that, because there's these material thinkers who come along and say, hold on a second, a God who is completely beyond being is kind of not that relevant to our lives. What's relevant to life is justice, mercy, peace, and goodness in this world. And God as a concept is just a really good way of looking at ourselves, just like people's dogs look like them, people's gods look like them, right? So you can tell about yourself by looking at your God. And then the week after, we look at the critique of that, where some theologians come in and say, yes, the very giving up of God for justice is the affirmation of God. So Dietrich Bonhoeffer says to live as though God is not given is to live fully before God and with God, because he says we have to give ourselves in love to the world. And ironically, that is the way of expressing faith. But what happens is you realize that atheism and theism dance together. Theism is an affirmation, atheism is a negation, and these move together. And that's always been in theology. Theology has been a conversation of affirmation and negation, of nomination and denomination, of theopoetics. So that's one way of thinking about how doubt and unknowing and complexity have been intimately interwoven with theology from the very start. But that's the least interesting bit of it. But anyway, I'll stop there for a second. Do you want to come back on any of that? Or
Well, that's what you talk about. I like how you always, one of the things I also appreciate you is you just do these little funny word games. So like you write atheism, then you put a slash between the A and the T, which captures exactly what you were just describing in these movements of the atheism for Lent. So actually, I don't know if I want to come back on that. I'd like to hear a little bit more. Maybe what about just responding to this? So is it actually reality then? Because I know a lot of people, we have a phenomenon now where lots of persons who formerly thought they were Christians have just essentially deconstructed in some way. And when I hear a lot of people talk, I always kind of think, well, really they're just deconstructing from probably a false view of God in some ways, and they don't realize that, God might be more profound than they imagine, and they're just rejecting something that probably needs to be rejected. But it seems as though we've set people up in the modern world for some reason, so it's almost like one of my colleagues, if you remember the Hindenburg that the Nazis built, this gigantic blimp, it blew up because it was hydrogen, I think, and it like a spark just blows the whole thing up. And I think sometimes people, maybe because they're addicted to certainty, I'd like to hear you critique this, like literally everything blows up as soon as there's one contradiction gets pointed out, and the whole thing falls like a stack of dominoes. So what I'm hearing you say, though, is when you explore these really deep thinkers, even a person who might claim to be an atheist might actually be more theistic than they think. They just don't understand the role between this back and forth contradiction, certainty piece. So what would you say to someone who feels like they're in a free fall away from faith? Or maybe it's the other thing. Maybe they've been an atheist and they're in a free fall to faith, but they feel like they're rejecting everything just because they found uncertainty. So what would you say to a person, again, which either way they're moving, whether they're moving towards theism or moving towards atheism?
Yeah. So this is where Paul Tillich, and you mentioned Tillich, is interesting because Tillich in The Courage to Be, the book you mentioned, he really beautifully draws out how a type of lack exists within us. So the most basic form of this is death, right? So and he looks at that first. Death is the ultimate lack, right? No life. And he says there's a weak form of that, which is you kind of realize you're going to die someday, and maybe you go to the doctors and you're worried, you have an illness, and you have this sense of anxiety over death, this lack. That's a weak form of it. But then, of course, the strong form is when you realize that death is coming. Whatever you think about the afterlife, you're going to have to end this life. And Tillich talks about that being still an anxiety for many people. But in the past, it was a very strong anxiety because death was all around you. People, like if you live in a society where people die, like your children die very easily, where you don't live for very long, where your parents might die very young, death is all around you. But in a society where death is a little bit more controlled, and hospitals, people who are dying are not visible, he says the second form of lack is a bit more insidious, and he calls that kind of basically what I talked about is guilt, the sense of I am not who I should be. And the weak form of that is, I did something bad and I'm not who I should have been better. And the strong part of it is you feel like there's nothing you could ever do to be who you want to be. That's condemnation. And then he mentions the third, and the third is meaninglessness. And he talks about this mostly in terms of the contemporary world, which is a lack of meaning. And the weak form is when I go, I don't like my job, I should get a more meaningful job. And the strong form is when you think, oh, there's nothing meaningful in life at all. Now, the funny thing about Tillich is Tillich says, you got to go into this, right? This is dialectics. Dialectics is always, if you've got two choices, you take the worst, right? For example, you kind of always want to be happy, and you tell yourself, I'm happy, I'm happy, I'm happy. And you look in the mirror and you say some mantra to say, I'm not going to let any negative thoughts into my life. I'm going to be positive, right? So that's the choice of happiness over unhappiness. But if you go to analysis or therapy, you have to go the other direction, right? The therapist brings you precisely into the sadness. But they're not doing that because they hate you or they're sadistic. They're doing that because they know that only by going into the darkness can you find the light. That actually the more you avoid the negative feelings, the more they will return in violent, aggressive ways. They'll return bodily in stress and disease, or in anger at your kids, or in doing something horrible to somebody else. So it'll always come back. The same thing as, if you're, it's the whole thing in the Bible. It's like if you've got selfishness or selflessness, where, if you choose, or how would I say, well, let's talk about life and death. You choose death as in love. You die to somebody, you go like, you're more important to me than myself. But weirdly, in doing that, you find yourself having a very rich and meaningful life in the very kind of renunciation of your selfishness. There's a selfish experience, this experience of joy. So that's dialectics. And so Tillich is saying, you go into the darkness, you go into death. You don't go half-heartedly. You don't go halfway. You don't try to mix the two. No. If there's a wide path and a narrow path, this is a crazy idea. You take the narrow path, right? Madness. But the reason, Tillich says, is when you go into your complete experience of the loss of meaning, what's called the death of God in philosophy, when you go into this experience of the loss of everything, you will find yourself affirming something. And I'll say it in a very basic way, in three very basic ways. He does this in a beautiful book called My Search for Absolutes. One is, if you're arguing about whether or not truth exists, you're already presupposing truth. So that's not a trap. This is not a kind of like first year philosophy trap, right? But this is a sense of which, if you're arguing with somebody about the nature of truth, you're already presupposing, one, that you can communicate with each other, that there's a way of coming to some sort of conclusion about this, that even if you say everything is relative, you're making one non-relativistic claim, which is everything is relative. So you're making a truth claim, right? Now, that means you don't argue to truth, you argue from it. And then philosophy is attempting to go, okay, what can we learn from that? But the same thing as the artist who's painting something beautiful. They're painting something beautiful. They're trying to incarnate beauty, but they always fail. But they're inspired by beauty. They're already standing within it. They're already lured by beauty. And finally, the lawyer who's trying to be just never writes a law that's completely just. There's always an injustice to the justice, but they are writing from justice. They are inspired by and standing within it. So it sounds weird at first, but it's almost like the more you go into the experience of loss and lack of meaning, when you fully embrace that darkness, you go into what the mystics call the dark night of the soul, and you end up actually feeling more secure and less anxious and more affirmative of life than if you had avoided that dark night. Does that make sense? I mean, I know it makes sense to you, but yeah.
No, I think it makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think I've experienced that even personally over the years. But one of the questions that people that I hear sometimes from that is, and I'll use a psychological term, would be, at what point would, again, Tillich, and even you just expressed, there's some point at which you come out of this dark phase, but some folks wonder, how long do you stay in the darkness, and at what point does that become sort of a narcissistic trap over against the place where you're really going to have a breakthrough? You've had to have heard something like that before. How do you respond to a person that's worried about doing the journey because they feel like it's becoming too self-focused?
Yes, no, 100%. And the funny thing, you know, a lot of the dialectics is about going into death to find like I'm not actually a big fan of too much kind of introspection, unless, because we don't know ourselves very well. The best way to know yourself is to actually look at what you do, not how you think, right? So I'm not a depth. I'm very against depth psychology, which is the truth of who you are is within you. Bonhoeffer, Mother Teresa as well were very against this notion. Like, no, the truth of who you are is in your, well, let's say symptoms. The truth of who you are is, and other people will see you better than you see yourself, because it's not by delving deep down within that you find something. It's in your everyday practice. But that's come back.
That's good too, though. That's really good. Yeah.
That's, by the way, what Freud means by the unconscious. Interesting is that the unconscious is not subconscious, right? So you sometimes hear people say, make a mistake and talk about the subconscious. That's a more Jungian notion. The unconscious, the reason why Freud uses unconscious is because the unconscious is not beneath consciousness, it's within it. It's like, and you see this all the time when somebody says, for example, there's a bad signal and they're saying, oh, we're breaking up, I can't hear you. And, they're in a bad relationship and the truth has just been spoken on the surface. We're breaking up, right? Or somebody gives somebody else advice very passionately about why they should leave their job. And you can hear in it that they want to leave their partner. It's all on the surface. So anyway, that's beside the point. So here's my thing about this is the irony is depression. It's a complex thing, but let's simplify it that a lot of depression is connected with the idea of a sacred object, something that if you had, you would be happy. So depression is not depressing enough, right? So René Girard that once had a parable where he said, imagine there's a guy who's told that there's treasure under a rock in a rocky field. And after going through 100 rocks in the field, not finding any treasure, he eventually tries to find the one rock that he can't lift, right? And the point of the parable is the guy wants to find a rock that he can't lift so that he can maintain the fantasy that there is a treasure beneath it, right? Rather than experience the trauma that there's no treasure in the field at all, that he just has to live his life like everybody else, right? My issue with a lot of depression is it hasn't got to the point where it's actually let go of the lost object. So for example, I'm imagining this woman who I could have been with. If only, life had been different and, she didn't get married to that person, whatever. And I'm held to this, but it's only when I realize, not intellectually, right, but deep existentially that, hold on, if we'd got married, it would have been a nightmare. It might have been okay, but it would have also, we'd been arguing about the laundry. We'd argue about who's going to put the bins out, right? It wouldn't be this incredibly emotional and sexual, incredible dynamic. That fantasy is generated from the very impossibility. That person has become idealized and therefore fantasized. And so my whole argument about why you have to go absolutely in is if you don't go fully in, you don't experience the salvation. You don't experience the cure. It's like, that's why I was saying, I remember I said, you don't go halfway or you don't go mixed. Because if you go halfway, the sacred object remains and you don't have the break. This, by the way, connects very much with Christianity again. So remember I told you about the Bible starts with an Oedipal story, Adam and Eve, there's the sacred fruit, the prohibition, right? And the whole thing's a trauma because Adam and Eve, just like Oedipus, they break through the prohibition, they get the fruit. It's a disaster. It's cursed. Now, in Christianity, you have the recreation of the Garden of Eden with the Temple of Jerusalem. You have the court of Gentiles where everybody can go in and hang out. You've got the sacred kind of holy of holies, and then you've got a massive curtain that prevents you going in. So similar to, the Garden of Eden, the three parts, the sacred place of the tree, the prohibition, and where everyone can walk. And then interestingly, when Christ crucified, the curtain rips. You see inside the Holy of Holies. And my argument is this is the nihilistic heart of Christianity. It's the realization there's nothing in there. It's just a room, right? It's the thing is torn, and you see the nihilistic truth that there's nothing in there that will make you whole and complete. Now that's devastating. That's called the death of God. Mm-hmm. However, the interesting thing for me is as you fully embrace that experience and symbolically identify with it, you enter into resurrection. And resurrection is where the sacred is not an object that you can grasp. The sacred is not an object that you love. The sacred is now a depth dimension that you experience in the act of love itself. God is no longer an object that you love, but God is a reality experienced when you love. Right, so you can't love God, right? You can't love God because God is not an object that you love. All you can do is love. But when you love, you experience God because God is love, right? That's the move. But for me, you can only get to that place of resurrection life when you fully enter into this experience of loss. And can I throw one more thing in? This is
great. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, because this is where my work has come. Like if people looked at my work, the early work is about doubt, complexity, ambiguity, experiencing how they're interwoven into faith, how we can, begin to go into the dark night of the soul, all of that. My more mature work, I think, I don't want to say it's too mature because that means I'm going to die soon. So hopefully I've got a few years left, but is that as I get more drawn into the work of people like Hegel, what I want to say is this, right? It's not that... It's interesting that on Christ crucified, this notion, this image of Christ crucified, you have this notion of God not being at one with God. Mm-hmm. So I don't feel at one with myself, right? I talked about death, guilt, meaninglessness, right? I don't feel at one with myself. I have anxiety because anxiety is connected with that experience of lack, right? So I have anxiety. I feel incomplete. I want to identify with God, who is complete and whole. I identify then with Christ. But then Christ experiences a gap. And Christ experiences an absence of Christ. So as I identify with Christ, I realize that God is self-divided. I am self-divided God. So my self-division, my doubt, ambiguity, complexity, my sense of alienation is redoubled within Christ, which is called double kenosis. So the first kenosis is God becomes nothing, becomes human. The second kenosis is God experiences a lack within God. Mm-hmm. I experience that. That's when the temple curtain rips, which symbolically means that's the moment when I go, oh my goodness, this thing that I thought would make me whole and complete is also incomplete. But then I realize that it's in embracing that incompleteness is where life and meaning and beauty is, right? And one more thing on that. What was I going to say? I don't know. I forget. Do you want to jump in and I'll try and recall my last thought on that?
That was.
Yes.
Go ahead, please.
Well, that's my coffee machine, by the way, turning off. I forgot to turn it off. It'll cycle through for a second. Whenever I say that God is self-divided, right? This gets us to radical theology. This seems very weird, but right, this is a very unique thing about Christianity. Like in Christianity, God dies, not an avatar of God, not kind of a prophet of God, but it says God dies. So what does that mean? Mm-hmm. Well, that means, if you put that into philosophical language, that the absolute is not at one with itself. The idea, whenever Christ experiences the absence of Christ, from the philosophical rendering of that, to render that into logic, is The absolute is divided. Now, what does that mean? That sounds crazy, but I'll tell you, there's names for that. In biology, it's called evolution. Evolution is the non-at-oneness of a biological organism, right? So a biological organism is not at one with itself. It has this kind of not at oneness that allows for adaptation, selection, reproduction, right? In physics, it's called wave-particle duality. Wave-particle duality is the non-at-oneness of physical being itself, right? In mathematics, it's called the incompleteness theorem, where Gödel shows that mathematics falls into contradiction at its axiomatic level, right? In psychoanalysis, it's called the unconscious. The unconscious is the not at oneness of the subject with itself, that there is a kind of like a contradiction within subjectivity. Within politics, it's called democracy. Democracy is the name for the non at oneness of the social body, right? All of these are generative dimensions. Democracy is generative within politics. Wave particle duality is generative within physics. It's the nature of reality itself. Evolution is generative of biological organisms. The unconscious is generative of subjectivity. Those are just some names for it. I would say in Christianity, it's called salvation. And salvation is the experience of the absolute not being at one with itself. And as we fold ourselves into that experience, we find a depth of meaning like nothing before. And it breaks us free from the frenetic pursuit of wholeness and completeness, which I would argue is the disease of the present age, probably the disease of every age.
That was really powerful. And we'll have to call this middle Pete Rollins, so since it's not your mature version.
Yeah. Thank you.
We're just 100 years from now, when someone's listening to this, this was the middle version of Pete Rollins. We'll see. And so you start, just to connect some readers with some of your works, a lot of the stuff that you talked about with Adam and Eve, and even the temple. Now, I think I've read all of your books. That sounds like Divine Magician, and is that your most recent book that you've put out too, right? So are you coming out with a new volume at some point? Like, what's the next book look like? Or even more interesting, maybe from what you said, what's the book you're afraid to write that you hope to write someday? Or
that's a great question. So I wrote a pile of books in a row. So I wrote 6 major books, but like I say major, like I also did a graphic novel, which I'll come to in a second, but 6 kind of philosophy, theology books. The last of which, as you said, was The Divine Magician, which is actually now quite a few years ago.
Yeah, it's good.
Like, I stopped with that book because at the time I felt that I articulated in written form what I wanted to say. Mm-hmm. Then I went into, since then, teaching. So I'm doing a lot this was the growth of podcasting. Technology got so much better. YouTube got so much better. So I really went into that area, and I've been doing my work there. And my next thing is, I'm very excited that you'll be the first person I've talked to about this, actually. But cool. I am kind of getting into, you might know this because I've done a bit, but I was getting into film production, writing and producing film. So I've done 3 short films that I produced, one that I kind of wrote, Jamaica, Making Love, and Alone. This was a stepping stone to try to establish a way of making popular art that would articulate these theological ideas. So at the moment, I am working on an animated series based on this graphic novel I made called, as you know, Enduring Love. And it's going to take parables from around the world and put them into this lonely forest and bring these stories to life. Some of them will be my stories. Many of them will be stories from around the world. And trying to get these ideas in animated form to kind of young people and whatever. And then I'm working on producing a documentary called An American Contradiction, which will be about Tammy Faye Baker, because Tammy Faye Baker brought together people you'd never think would come together, right? And not in some half-hearted way, right? She would have somebody from the trans community. RuPaul loves, Tammy Faye. So she was very, very embraced by the gay community, very embraced by the fundamentalist community. You go like, how do these people all come together? Crying and laughing and telling stories about Tammy Faye. She basically was a kind of contradictory figure who was small town and yet really kind of like larger than life, who was so sincere and honest and yet hid behind so much kind of makeup, who was, who was very religious and yet also doing this kind of very kind of flashy kind of like television life. So all of these contradictions were in Tammy, and she brought together people who you would never think would come together. By the way, think about who else is a person who brought together two groups that you would never have thought would have ever been linked. The Apostle Paul, Jew and Gentile, right? So Tammy Faye expresses a type of Pauline ability to bring together a group who before that you'd never have thought would work. And I think today we need a Tammy Faye. We need a way to break the divisions. And we need a way to break the divisions, not in sense of a compromise, but in some radical way that something comes up that so cuts across all the social antagonisms that a new reality is born. So I'm moving into TV and film, but I do want to get back to writing at some stage as well. But this medium that we're doing at the moment, it just got so good that after writing The Divine Magician, I was like, I can reach more people in one podcast than in a whole book. And but it's really annoying because I do love writing and I do need to get back to it.
Yeah, I hope you do for the long term, but I actually agree. That's why I've been doing this podcast, and I do a lot of videos myself, just because it seems like so many more, it makes our work so much more accessible. And we're living this world now. You go on YouTube and I mean, literally you can find anything you want. So we might as well have the kind of stuff that we do and love, put that out there for people that are really hungry. And again, I love connecting. I mean, maybe you can just say something about your Patreon. Plus you have, just free things too, but your Patreon, through the patreon.com, your site there, you put on regular lectures and conversations where, I come to these sometimes. You can go live and actually ask you questions. You give a lecture, you do book studies. Talk a little bit about that work in case folks might be interested in really taking a real deep dive into your own work and like literally on the weekends. They can connect with you on Saturdays and Sundays sometimes.
Yeah, thanks for the promo there.
Yeah.
This is what I love about the tech is I could not 10, 15 years, when I was young and doing my PhD and all of that, I could not have had access to world-class things. All I could do is read their books by going to a library, and I couldn't sit down and have a coffee with them and ask questions. Now, so I do, as you know, I do a thing, for example, called Coffee and Concepts once a month, where we literally grab a coffee, we sit down in a Zoom room, I introduce a concept. The next concept I think I'm doing is commodity fetishism. But I take a concept, it might be projection or it might be theism. I talk for 20 minutes and then we kind of have a conversation. I'm like, my goodness, that's opening up so many possibilities. Some of the thinkers that I respect deeply today, I can literally talk to, I have access to. So I try to make sure that 80% of everything I do is free. Like if someone's interested in my work, you will find hundreds of hours of it anywhere. You can probably get my books pirated off the internet, no problems, feel free, So it's all free and out there. The irony is the more you give away free, the more people want to support you. When I was doing this work and most of my life I've been, haven't had money. But I realized the more I gave for free, people were like, how do I support you? They were actually asking me. And eventually a few people said, you should go onto this thing called Patreon. And, the lovely thing about Patreon is the more you give for free, but the more somebody goes, well, I'm not paying to get the secret knowledge, right? What you usually do, if I was wise, you go, right, here, Brian, I'll give you 3 points of how to lead a satisfied life. But see the last two, that's behind a paywall, right? And then you have to go behind a paywall. It's like, do it all free. But then what you're paying for, it's great because one is all the information is there, but then I do festivals in Ireland. So somebody might go, yeah, but I want to spend 5 days drinking in an Irish pub with you, listening to some local Irish music, asking questions and hearing talks. You can do that. Or as you say on Patreon, there's like monthly talks, there's coffee and concepts. We're now, there's film groups. We do all of this kind of stuff. And so so much free there if anybody who's listening wants to just dive in. But the beautiful thing is I can, for $5 or whatever, because if I have enough, I had one patron. When I came to America, I was unemployed in Ireland, I was living in a squat for a while in Ireland, a very wealthy individual called Brian, who, the good friend of mine now, the family, they liked my work and they said, we want to support you for 3 years. And I was like, what does that mean? And go like, well, we'll just pay for everything for 3 years. What do you mean pay for everything? Go, come to America and you don't have to worry for 3 years. So after 3 years, you might have to get a real job, but for 3 years, we'll just pay for everything. It's very bizarre. And I actually said no for a whole year. I said no because I thought there might be strings attached. And he kept saying, there's no strings attached. You can take the money and do nothing. You can go to Hawaii. And so I eventually did this, came to America. They supported me for 3 years, and that allowed me to get on my feet. And now instead of one big patron, there's just kind of lots of people to kind of basically give me the equivalent of a couple of coffees a month. And I'm able to do this kind of work and have this kind of access. So it's an amazing technology. That's why it's hard to write. Because sit and write a book, it takes you 6 months to kind of do all of the work. And then it takes 6 months before it comes out. It takes about 1.5 years from when you start to write the book for when it comes out. Or I can be in my pajama bottom. So right now I'm naked from the waist down. You don't even know, right? And I'm sitting here talking to you and I'm getting the stuff out straight away. It's an incredible moment.
No, it's great. It's great. Let me just ask you a couple quick questions. I'm going to be mindful of your time. And again, I'm going to put connections to all of Dr. Peter Rollins' work, including his fantastic podcast he does with a comedian, Elliot Morgan. The Fundamentalist is really good. So I'll put links to all of your stuffs and all of Dr. Rollins' books as well. So Pete, this is kind of a fun question. Imagine that you can help design a seminary curriculum. What would be a class that you would add that might not typically be in a curriculum? And again, I don't know how much you know what we teach in seminaries, but what would be a class that you would think would be essential for a person that wanted to be a pastor that probably doesn't show up in the traditional Bible, theology, pastoral care type of thing?
Yeah, you're right. Okay, you mentioned that you might ask something like this, and I really like this question because, in some respects, this is very important because they're going like, what about the seminaries for the future? And the boring answer, and there might be more interesting answers, but a boring answer is like, I really do think it's important to have like classes that really look at this notion of contradiction. So looking at Hegel, looking at Lacan, looking at, and so I do think there's a return of Hegel. So in the philosophy world, when I did my PhD, Hegel was kind of the philosopher to hate, in a sense. Or Hegel was the philosopher of totality. He was the one who tried to work everything out. And I actually didn't read much Hegel, even though I was in continental philosophy, because everything was post-Hegel, and I was very much reading Derrida and that. And then but Hegel's come back because these great philosophers never go away for long, like good fashion or whatever. And the big thing about Hegel now is a lot of people are reading him and going, Hegel was all about the centrality of contradiction. And here was the problem. So when Hegel wrote, after he died, there were two streams that came out of Hegel. One was the young Hegelians, and the other was the right Hegelians. So the right Hegelians were more theological and more conservative, and the young Hegelians were more political. So the young Hegelians were like Feuerbach and Marx. And then after that, they were the most successful ones because, got to say, they were the young, most talented ones, right? The young Hegelians were incredibly brilliant, and right to the present day, they've had a massive impact. The right Hegelians didn't go very far, didn't go too far, but it was within theology a little bit. The argument of Todd McGowan, thinker that I really like, is that this was a disaster, that actually splitting Hegel's religious work from his political possibilities has created what McGowan calls the right-wing deviation of the left. I think that's a very good name for it. Because what McGowan argues is that actually Hegel's notion of religion is so central, because Hegel basically argues that in Christianity, contradiction is raised to the highest level. The infinite and the finite come together. That which cannot be killed is killed, right? The essential exists, the highest and the lowest. All of these concepts, all these contradictions are coalesced within the cross. And so for Hegel, there's actually something incredibly orthodox. He kind of goes like, Christianity can help us really enter into this contradiction. Once you lose that, you have this political thing that's all about contradiction, but ultimately is about overcoming it. It's about saying that we can eventually get to a state in which contradiction is overcome. And that's what humanism is. That's why Feuerbach is kind of a humanist, because within humanism, you have this secular theology of kind of like God is a reflection of our own selves. So all the essence of God is really who we are and who we can be. And so there's a kind of wholeness and there's a kind of utopian dimension of we can eventually become everything that we think God is and have a type of utopic future. Now, for Hegel, he's like, no, that very belief is what leads to problems. That's the very belief that leads you to Stalinism, to thinking that you can kill millions of people because you're on the right side of history, because you know where it's going. You're on the side of truth and you know where truth leads. Hence, you can silence people. Hence, you can destroy people's livelihoods without feeling guilt, because you know you're on the right side of history and they're on the wrong side of history. For Hegel, this is great. For Hegel, he's an apocalyptic thinker. He's not a progressive, he's an apocalypticist. So a progressive is someone who knows where everything's going. They know the arc of history, all of that. An apocalypticist doesn't. An apocalypticist says, every time I imagine the perfect future, I'm just idealizing my own values. Just like whenever people say, fulfill your dreams. Well, no, you don't want to fulfill your dreams. You want to dream new ones. Your dreams are idealized reflections of your present reality. So I dream about being rich, right? That's not going to make me happy, right? So being an apocalypticist means this. It means that you have to enter into political dialogue going, I don't know what the future holds, but I believe that antagonism and conflictual conversation and fighting together is going to lead to new possibilities and new directions. An apocalyptic moment in politics was the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland, where the various political parties came together, not knowing what the future of Northern Ireland would be, but said, we cannot stand what is, we have to change through because apocalypse, as you know, means the incoming of something you cannot imagine. So it's an apocalypse. It's like, we don't know what's going to happen. So when you take that seriously, I think you avoid this notion of, oh, I know the truth. And so the political moment is about saying what you have to do is raise the contradictions of the moment, raise all the problems and the injustices that are going on, bring them to the surface so that they can't be hidden. And then we try to work it out for the future. Now, all of this to say, in seminary, I would love to see courses on Hegel's religion, really deep dives into that. And it's in his phenomenology of spirit, it's basically the second to last section, is to kind of really understand how for Hegel, the embrace of contradiction, the embrace of incompleteness is central to Christianity. And then I would love to see, I think that can connect with things like modern science and what's going on in physics and biology and in mathematics. So that's my course. And if you're thinking about what course to bring in, I think that would be very helpful, because my concern is actually existing Christianity is Gnosticism. It's caught in the pursuit of wholeness, completeness, satisfaction at its core. That's my central claim, is that forget about whether Christianity is Christian or whatever, in all the bits and pieces, all the rubbish bits and pieces, forget about that. For me, it's the core, is that there is this pursuit of wholeness, completeness, certainty, and satisfaction. And I would love to see a seminary course that offers a critique of that. And I think you find that in Hegel, Zizek, McGowan. So at some stage, I'm going to teach a course in seminary. So invite me over to do a course sometime. I'll do Zizek and McGowan for seminarians.
You just gave a brilliant answer. You opened up such a can of worms. I mean, I know we got to shut this conversation down, but I just want to say this is really interesting, because you said one of my favorite boogeyman words, Gnosticism. And because what I've noticed, and again, I'm not asking you to respond to this, but what's really fascinating, some of the listeners will know this, like right now, Gnosticism is the boogeyman word that both left and right are throwing at each other in theology right now, accusing each other of being Gnostics. And you literally just painted the whole thing, and it fits so well into your work. Again, you don't have to comment on that, but I'd love at some point down the road, I may come back to you and pick your brain on that, because that was really profound. And I think some of the folks that are listening to this will know exactly where I'm getting at on that. Just
That's
one.
interesting. I didn't know that. That's fascinating. So that's within the theological seminary word that Gnosticism's thrown around. Oh, very interesting.
By like conservative evangelicals will consider progressives Gnostics, but you also hear the progressives call evangelicals Gnostics. And I think according to you, they're both sort of right, because there's this other piece. So that was just really interesting. I'm just going to name that. I'm going to have to go back and listen to that answer, because that was really interesting. Again, I'm running over, but do you have, if you're just going to quickly like lay out, 2 or 3 books that have been super helpful for you in your own growth, and these don't have to be necessarily spirituality books or whatever, but what if you're going to name 2 or 3 books that have really helped you, and you might say from a spiritual perspective or an intellectual perspective, what would be just 2 or 3 seminal books? And that's an impossible question for a professor, but that's why it's fun to ask.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like it's impossible, and yet it's a great question. And usually what I would say is, I would find a way to weasel my way out of that, because I would say, you have to know the person who has, but I'm not going to this time. I'm actually going to recommend some books that I think that I've read recently, that I do think, especially if you're saying that a lot of your listeners are actually within this seminary world, I'm really impressed at the moment with Todd McGowan.
Mm-hmm.
Now, he is not, it's funny because I invited him to my festival wake in Belfast. And it's funny because he doesn't write theology or anything like that, but I read his book, Enjoying What You Don't Have, and Capitalism and Desire. And I was like, these are profoundly theological texts. And I talked to him about it, and he said, well, actually, I did grow up in a very conservative religious background. And he says, secretly, the book that I really want to write is the book on Hegel and religion. And he says he's waiting to do it. So for me, for people who are listening who want a good, meaty, but also well-written book, I recommend either Enjoying What You Don't Have or Capitalism and Desire, reading them with a mind to, or an eye to, the theological dimension. So that's one. Zizek has been very important, as you know, to also opening my eyes to the importance of Hegel. And I'm thinking Zizek's he's written so many books. He's incredibly prolific. I'm trying to think of a book that's a good place to start with Zizek. He's a very engaging writer. Maybe he wrote a book recently called The Fragile Absolute. Sorry. Not the Fragile Absolute is another one of his books. What was his most recently? Sex in the Field Absolute. The Field Absolute. I think that. Yeah, and that's very, very good. And then for people who go like, what's the main text that I think is important for us to wrestle with over the next 40, 50 years? It's Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. And I recommend it if anybody wants to get into that. I'll be honest. I mean, it's almost impossible to read it first. And people will have to have like 3 or 4 commentaries. There's a commentary called The Logic of Desire by a guy called Peter Kalkava, I think it is. And it's a very good commentary. But if anybody wants to read that book, think of it like you're reading the Bible with 5 commentaries. Have lots of commentaries around you, and take it over a year. So there.
That's good.
Some thoughts.
Yeah, and I just want to say, everybody listening, for all these thinkers that Pete has talked about, McGowan's pretty accessible. I've read one of his books. I think it was the one on Hegel that we did in one of your classes, I think, at some point. That's a good one too.
That's a good one, actually. I forgot to mention that. Yes, yeah. That's called forget what this is, his book on Hegel. Forget the title, because he's not very good on titles. He's an incredible writer, but he chooses, I think he doesn't want people to read him, so he chooses very boring titles. I think he's very self-effacing. And the book on Hegel is very good.
But I was going to say, in Zizek and even Hegel and Lacan, it's really hard to read too. I I'll just joke about myself. I try to read introductions to Lacan, and I don't even understand the introductions with all the vocabulary. But what I was going to say to the listeners, if you've really, one of the reasons I love about talking to Pete, he's so generous even with this time, is that he's able to translate all of these, to me, really difficult European continental thinkers, and does it with humor, does it with grace, connects it with so many different things. So really encourage you, if you've been drawn to this conversation, check out some of Dr. Peter Rollins, his books, his podcasts, his videos, because he gives you access to these ideas in a way that I mean, frankly, I haven't found too many people that are actually able to do that. So, and just as a way, just at the end of this thing, I just want to thank you for your work that you do. I think it's really important. Thank you for your generosity, both in being my guest today, and also for all, like you said, all of the immense amount of lectures, videos, teaching, and even a Patreon account that you're not asking for a whole lot from folks. It's literally just a cup of coffee, and you get access to I know you won't like me when I say this, but like a great mind who is literally sharing that with the world, and you can come and talk to you in your living room. Basically, like you can talk to you right where you're standing right there. That's really are. So thank you so much for being my guest today, and I'm very grateful.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. Hopefully we'll do this again.
Yeah, thank you. And everyone, thanks for listening all the way to the end. Until next time, live by faith, be known by love, and be voices of hope. Thank you so much for listening all the way to the end of the Deep Dive Spirituality Conversations podcast. If you found this interview particularly helpful, would you share it with your network and or leave a review so others can find it? If you're interested in reading or connecting with the guests, please check out the show notes. And if you're interested in centering prayer, my book, Centering Prayer, How Sitting Quietly in God's Presence Can Change Your Life, will be out in late 2021. You can sign up for updates at centeringprayerbook.com. If I can serve you in any way, reach out, let me know. Until next time, have a wonderful week and be a blessing to someone today.